All right. This session is about persuasion. So I teach a class that seniors take about the research into how people persuade one another. And that class considers persuasion very, very broadly. It could be someone selling a product, that's persuasion, persuading someone to buy. That could be parents persuading their children to do wise things. It's doctors persuading patients to do healthy things. Anytime someone has a belief or an attitude or a behavior that you want to change, we are talking about persuasion. We're going to divide it into two parts. There is, first of all, the broad topic of persuasion, and then inside it, the topic of arguing, presenting arguments to try to change someone's beliefs or behaviors. But I want to start off with a little excerpt from a TED Talk by a professor of business at Columbia Business School. She actually is a psychologist, but a lot of business professors get their graduate degrees in psychology. She's kind of cool. I don't know if you'll notice, she's completely blind. And during this TED Talk, they showed for a moment her notes on the podium are in Braille. And I just love to watch that. But we're only going to watch, not the whole thing, just about 7 minutes of it.
Today I'm going to take you around the world in 18 minutes. My base of operations is in the U.S., but let's start at the other end of the map, in Kyoto, Japan, where I was living with a Japanese family while I was doing part of my dissertational research 15 years ago. I knew even then that
Let me see if I can get the subtitles on. I think I can. Oh, let's see if I can get Japanese ones on. That'd be cool. Okay, I'll start from there.
Encounter cultural differences and misunderstandings, but they popped up when I least expected it. On my first day, I went to a restaurant and I ordered a cup of green tea with sugar. After a pause, the waiter said, "One does not put sugar in green tea." I know, I said, I'm aware of this custom, but I really like my tea sweet. In response, he gave me an even more courteous version of the same explanation. One does not put sugar in green tea. I understand, I've said, that the Japanese do not put sugar in their green tea, but I'd like to put some sugar in my green tea. Surprised by my insistence, the waiter took up the issue with the manager. Pretty soon, a lengthy discussion ensued, and finally the manager came over to me and said, "I am very sorry, we do not have sugar." Well, since I couldn't have my tea the way I wanted it, I ordered a cup of coffee, which the waiter brought over promptly. Resting on the saucer were 2 packets of sugar. My failure to procure myself a cup of sweet green tea was not due to a simple misunderstanding. This was due to a fundamental difference in our ideas about choice. From my American perspective, when a paying customer makes a reasonable request based on her preferences, she has every right to have that request met. The American way, to quote Burger King, is to have it your way because, as Starbucks says, happiness is in your choices. But from the Japanese perspective, it's their duty to protect those who don't know any better. In this case, the ignorant gaijin for making the wrong choice. Let's face it, the way I wanted my tea was inappropriate according to cultural standards, and they were doing their best to help me save face. Americans tend to believe that they've reached some sort of pinnacle in the way they practice choice. They think that choice is seen through the American lens best fulfills an innate and universal desire for choice in all humans. Unfortunately, these beliefs are based on assumptions that don't always hold true. In many countries, in many cultures, at times they don't even hold true at America's own borders. I'd like to discuss some of these assumptions and the problems associated with them. As I do so, I hope you'll start thinking about some of your own assumptions and how they were shaped by your backgrounds. First assumption. If a choice affects you, then you should be the one to make it. This is the only way to ensure that your preferences and interests will be most fully accounted for. It is essential for success. In America, the primary locus of choice is the individual. People must choose for themselves, sometimes sticking to their guns regardless of what other people want or recommend. It's called being true to yourself. But do all individuals benefit from taking such an approach to choice? Mark Lepper and I did a series of studies in which we sought the answer to this very question. In one study, which we ran in Japantown, San Francisco, we brought 7 to 9-year-old Anglo and Asian American children into the laboratory and we divided them up into 3 groups. The first group came in and they were greeted by Miss Smith, who showed them 6 big piles of anagram puzzles. The kids got to choose which pile of anagrams they would like to do, and they even got to choose which marker they would write their answers with. When the second group of children came in, they were brought to the same room, shown the same anagrams, but this time Miss Smith told them which anagrams to do and which markers to write their answers with. Now when the third group came in, they were told that their anagrams and their markers had been chosen by their mothers. In reality, the kids who were told what to do, whether by Miss Smith or their mothers, were actually given the very same activity which their counterparts in the first group had freely chosen. With this procedure, we were able to ensure that the kids across the 3 groups all did the same activity, making it easier for us to compare performance. Such small differences in the way we administered the activity yielded striking differences in how well they performed. Anglo-Americans, they did 2.5 times more anagrams when they got to choose them, as compared to when it was chosen for them by Miss Smith or their mothers. It didn't matter who did the choosing. If the task was dictated by another, their performance suffered. In fact, some of the kids were visibly embarrassed when they were told that their mothers had been consulted. One girl named Mary said, "You asked my mother?" In contrast, Asian American children performed best when they believed their mothers had made the choice. Second best when they chose for themselves, and least well when it had been chosen by Miss Smith. A girl named Natsumi even approached Miss Smith as she was leaving the room and tugged on her skirt and asked, "Could you please tell my mommy I did it just like she said?"
All right. So that is to get us started on the idea that we will take up, and it will appear on the slide, but the idea of psychological reactance, that Americans do not like it when someone else tells them what to do. And that is one of the biggest differences in how persuasion works. Now, psychological reactance, or not liking being told, someone else telling you what to do, that shows up in populations, Japanese populations as well. Nobody likes being told what to do when it isn't what they want to do. But with Americans, it's much, much, much stronger. The easiest example for you to hold in your imagination is Americans were told to wear masks to protect other people from coronavirus, and there were fistfights, there were gunfights, just over wearing a mask. And the only reason was they were told to do it. So, where we're going to begin in the research on persuasion is with the reasoned action model. The reasoned action model. There are several different models that show up in research on persuasion. There are 3 that we'll talk about today. This one tries to capture what happens when you persuade people by telling them how similar they are or how different they are from their group. People can be persuaded by knowing what everybody else is doing. And the data show, and I don't think this will surprise you, that with Japanese people, this can be a very, very powerful way of persuading people. This is what everyone else is doing, so please do it. The model says there are two different groups that we pay attention to. One of them we call the injunctive norm. The injunctive norm. The other one we call the descriptive norm. The injunctive norm refers to what do the important people in your life want? What do the important people in your life want? So, let us say there is a city where a lot of the women in their 30s are putting in a lot of overtime at work. So they're working a lot more than 40 hours a week. They're working 60 hours or 70 hours. And there is concern that this is not good for their health. So there's a persuasive campaign to try to get women approaching middle age to do less overtime and just work the proper amount and then go be with other people. The injunctive norm, you might talk to them about your friends, your children, your neighbors, all would like to see more of you. Now, their neighbors and their children are not 30-year-old women necessarily. Their friends might be. But that would be people who were important to them, their injunctive norm. Here at Gaidai, lots of students, some graduate students, you might have a professor who is your advisor. And knowing what that professor expects of you, that would be the injunctive norm. But knowing what other students do, that would be the descriptive norm. So the reasoned action model says the way to persuade people, if you want them to change what they're doing, the tools that are available to you are talking to them about their injunctive norm, or talking about their descriptive norm, or both. Sometimes people make choices because they think that someone who is important in their life wants them to. And sometimes you can persuade them by correcting their misunderstandings about their injunctive norm. I have, at my university in the United States, counseled a lot of students who chose their major, and they hated it, and they were miserable. And they had mental health symptoms, bad ones. And they said, I can't face getting up and going to my classes every day. And I say, well, why are you in this major? And they say, well, my parents want me to major in this because I'll get a good job. And they're really afraid that I'm not going to have a good job if I major in what I want to. And I've sent a lot of those students back to talk with their parents because they'll sometimes admit to me, well, no, I haven't asked them, I just know. And sometimes the students will go and talk to their parents, and their parents will say, you should major in what you will feel enthusiastic and joyful about studying. We will figure out when the end of college comes what to do about a career. But if you hate your major so much that you can't go to class, that's not what we want for you. We want for you to be happy. So a situation like that, the persuasive message might be to tell them, you may have misunderstood what the important people in your life want. As far as the descriptive norm, there are a couple of campaigns I've seen over the years, persuasive projects to try to change college student behavior. I mentioned the first day. I live in Eugene, Oregon, and I teach at a tiny, tiny little Christian college. But right across the street from us is the big University of Oregon with 30,000 students. At the University of Oregon, A lot of students, not all, a lot of students go out multiple nights a week and they drink a lot of alcohol. There is a big binge drinking problem at the University of Oregon. One of the ways the university has tried to persuade them to change, they've put posters up around campus that will say, the average University of Oregon student has 2 servings of alcohol a week. And what they're trying to do, they're trying to reach students who think, I have to go and drink, because if I don't go, I'll be the lonely one who's left out, the only one not having fun. And if the university can help students understand, lots of students don't binge drink. You're normal if you don't go out and drink every night. You're not the only one. If they can get that information out there to where students think differently about what everyone in their descriptive norm is doing, that may shift the behavior. Now, I explain this entire model to you to say this. A lot of research has been done on how this works in the United States among weird populations, and all of it concludes it doesn't work very well. Trying to change people's behavior by changing their understanding of their injunctive norm doesn't work well. Often it backfires. Often it produces unintended and unwanted consequences. When it comes to trying to persuade people by adjusting the descriptive norm, a lot of times they choose the wrong group or the wrong behavior, or the target of the persuasive appeal, the audience for it, just doesn't believe the information, or they find out that they are different from their group and that makes them feel special, so they do the behavior even more. So all the other students just have 2 servings of alcohol a week, and I have 15 or 16 a week. I'm going to take it up to 20, because I can drink any other student at this university under the table. They just don't know how to have fun. It's funny, every time I teach that persuasion class, we talk through some of the other models, and then we get to this one, and they recognize people in the United States do respond to peer pressure. They do care what other people think. When I talk about it being there are individualist cultures and collectivist cultures, people in individualist cultures do care what other people think. There's a danger. I don't want you to leave this class thinking people are one or the other and they're at extremes. It's really kind of a matter of emphasis. What's the top priority? And the top priority in an individualist culture is what you want, but you're aware of what other people think. But efforts to try to persuade by talking about what the group is doing have been very, very limited and very, very ineffective. And the reason why, or at least one major reason why, I've already said it a couple of times, but if you're wondering how to spell it, that's it. Psychological reactance. My students in the United States get very, very, they find this kind of funny, that word has those 2 words have 8 syllables in them. It's a long couple of words. It's the simplest idea I think I teach in any one of my classes. Don't tell me what to do. That's all psychological reactance is. If someone wants to do something and you tell them not to do it, if I said to Fabi-san, don't write with that pen, use that one, I think I would find psychological reactance. Don't tell me what pen to use. So, what do we do about it? Honestly, The strategy that is a lot more effective, we call cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive, the word just refers to thinking. Dissonance, on the other hand, if we had in here, let's say, a piano, and I do this sometimes when I teach this, if we're in a room where and there are lots of rooms at my university that have pianos in them, I'll play two notes that sound good together, that are harmony. I'll play a third, a C and an E. But then you can play some notes that sound bad together. Some notes that, don't do that. Those aren't good to listen to. And the word for that is dissonant. Two musical notes that sound like they don't fit together are dissonant. So cognitive dissonance is pointing out that someone has a thought they believe very strongly, and then another thought that cannot also be true that they also believe. So one thing they believe very strongly, and something else they believe that can't be true at the same time. Or a thought they believe very strongly and a behavior that is not okay if that's what they really think. One of the best cognitive dissonance persuasive strategies I have ever heard of. It was an anti-smoking campaign to get people to smoke fewer cigarettes. And it was in Thailand. This is what they did. Several children were recruited and trained to do this. They would walk up to adults who were outside a building smoking. And they would just kind of tug their sleeve and get their attention and say, could I borrow your lighter? And the adult would look down, and here would be an 8-year-old child holding a cigarette. And what happened a lot of the time is the adult would say to the child, no, you can't borrow my lighter. Smoking is terrible for you. Smoking will rot your lungs out. You'll be sick. You won't be able to run and play. And the child was then trained to hand over a little leaflet. And the adult would open it, and it would say, if you care that much about me, why don't you care that much about yourself? That's cognitive dissonance. You don't think it's okay to hurt yourself with smoking, and you see it clearly when I ask you for your lighter, but you're smoking. You have this very strong belief, but then you have this behavior. And the thing about cognitive dissonance strategies, do you remember this morning we said one form of power was information? That cognitive dissonance strategy, if you care that much about me, why don't you care that much about yourself? Those are two facts. The person has just admitted smoking is harmful, and they're standing smoking. That's an exercise of information power. And with cognitive dissonance strategies, really, you get people to persuade themselves. Because they realize the thoughts they have, it feels uncomfortable to think two things at the same time that cannot both be true. So now what I'm going to do, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this later. The other thing that I want to mention in talking broadly about persuasion is a much newer theory. It's only been around since the 1990s, about 30 years. Cognitive dissonance goes back to the 1960s, so about 60 years. But this theory, narrative transportation. Narrative transportation. This one is almost as simple as psychological reactance. Narrative transportation, the theory says, one of the best ways to persuade people without the problems of psychological reactance is to tell them a story. The leading scholar of narrative transportation, who is still, I believe, has not yet retired and is still researching away, her name is Melanie Green. She is a professor in New York at the University at Buffalo. Whenever she talks to people about narrative transportation theory, she says, a story will make a soldier go to war and a child go to bed. That's how powerful stories are as persuasive tools. One of her classic experiments demonstrating how stories persuade, she took a control group and she gave them a presentation on the dangers of mentally ill people with specific mental health conditions, not broadly mentally ill people, but people who hallucinate and also have a feeling of being threatened, so specific kinds of mental illness. And she said, our mental health resources are not adequate. We have people who have uncontrolled mental illness. At times, they get into arguments that escalate and there is violence. What we need is the laws to change so that they can be committed against their will if they have a pattern of violence. And she presented that whole message to the control group. She made a very standard argument and persuasive appeal. Down the hall, with the experimental condition, she told them the story of Bob, who wandered through the shopping mall, talking to people who weren't there, seeing things that weren't there, and then came upon a mother and her 9-year-old daughter, and Bob pulled out a knife and stabbed the daughter right in the chest. At the end of those two messages, Professor Green asked the participants, do we need to change the laws to allow mentally ill people with a history of violence to be held against their will? And the people who heard the story overwhelmingly said yes. And the people who heard the traditional persuasive appeal were very divided and had a lot of concerns. She has, since then, done a lot of work about different kinds of stories, different things you can do to increase the transportation effect of a story, what you can do with the characters in the story. What is the effect of being very familiar with the setting and the events of the story? If someone plays a sport and you tell a story about that sport, does that increase the persuasive effect for the person hearing it? And what narrative transportation does is it largely bypasses the problem of psychological reactance, because when you persuade someone by telling them a story, have you ever watched a movie, read a book, and just found yourself lost in the story to where in your imagination you almost existed in the story? That's what she says happens with the stories that really persuade us. We get lost in the story. In the imagination, in our imagination, we are in the story. And we've known forever that one of the most persuasive things that can happen to a person is to have an experience. You can tell people to slow down and not drive so fast, but if they almost have an accident while driving too fast, that's what will slow them down, because they experience it. And she says a well-told story in their imagination creates the experience. So those are the approaches to persuasion that work a lot better, honestly, with Americans. They're a lot more effective than the kind of reasoned action model appeals that talk about what other members of the group are doing. I don't know of much research that's been done on narrative transportation with Japanese audiences. I would think it would work well. And there is some on cognitive dissonance with Japanese audiences. My point is not to say that these don't work with Japanese people. I think they do. My point is to say group-based persuasive appeals don't work with Americans. These do. And primarily these do because of psychological reactance. All right. That gets us through the broad category of persuasion. What I want to do, fairly briefly, we talked before, or I've mentioned before, a bunch of times that I taught argument at SUDA, that I was a debate coach, that I've looked into the research on how argument behavior is different between American people and Japanese people. And I want to take just a couple of minutes to give you a couple of the findings out of that, some of the differences. One particular researcher who's done a lot of work on communication differences between the United States and Japan is a man named Donald Klopf. Donald Klopf. And he says that Japanese participants in his studies, they talk about arguing the way Americans talk about science. To a lot of Americans, science is what a scientist goes into the laboratory to do, and Americans will say things like, "I'm not a scientist." Klopf said that Japanese participants in his stories say that arguing, that's something that academics do. That's something that specialists do. But normal people with normal feelings, they talk back and forth in ways that reach the heart. That arguing is too cold. Logic is too cold. But instead being considerate and thinking about other people's feelings, that's how healthy, likable people relate to each other. Now, Klopf, he comes back and says, Americans, as they go through school, they take classes in science, they take lab sciences in high school, in college. They do that so that they understand science when they read about it or hear about it in the news. They do it so that they understand how to solve problems, because learning about science teaches you problem solving. And I will say, Japanese people argue. They just believe that they're not supposed to. It's almost what we said earlier about power distance. Power exists everywhere. It's a matter of how comfortable are you. Japanese people do argue. There's a legal profession. There are Japanese lawyers. And privately, in conversation, in casual conversation with friends, Japanese people make lots of arguments naturally. They just don't like doing it when it seems as though it's an important topic or if it's in public, because somehow it feels wrong, like it's not supposed to happen. One other study I wanted to cite for you. Researcher, I didn't put down the first name, but her last name was Oi. And what she did, she had American participants and Japanese participants. She gave them a prompt to write an essay. And it was, should people with a painful terminal illness be able to end their own life? Please say yes or no, and please make the case for your answer. Please give reasons for your answer. And here's what she found. She found that when Japanese participants wrote their argument, they were a lot more indirect. They often wouldn't come to the point until the end. They would often say, there are good reasons on both sides. It's a difficult issue. And the one that really, really caught my attention, you will not be surprised. Owie said that American participants were very quick to say, well, here's what the Bible says. Even American participants who said that they were not religious. And they would say, and in some ways this is setting us up for our conversation later this afternoon about health communication, they would say, well, life is sacred. And life is sacred because we are all created in God's image. People who were not, Americans who were not church-going people, they would offer that as their reason. All right. Let me try to trace what I think are some of the Christian roots of the things that we've talked about. We talked about group-based appeals. The reasoned action model does not seem to work well with people from the United States. And I have two Bible passages, one from the early part of the Bible and one Jesus teaching, that I want to play for you very briefly. They're both short. This is God giving a command to the people of Israel. So you shall not follow the crowd if the crowd is doing something that is not right, something that is not just. And then Jesus, over here, So I mentioned the day that we did individualism and collectivism, that Americans, as they are being raised, are taught to resist peer pressure. And you don't do things just because everybody else in the group is doing them. What I just played to you, wide is the road that leads to destruction, narrow is the road that leads to life. Americans will spontaneously quote that to each other, even some that don't go to church. Take the narrow road, not the wide road. And what they mean by that is, don't follow the crowd when the crowd is doing something wrong. And that's a very basic teaching that they get from childhood on up about right versus wrong. Now, on the question of cognitive dissonance, I have two passages very quickly to show you. One, again, is Jesus' teaching. It's just one verse long. I use that when I teach persuasion on my Christian campus to give them a real easy example of a cognitive dissonance appeal. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? You say that I'm your Lord, you don't obey me. Make up your mind. That's a cognitive dissonance appeal. Here's one that's even clearer. Bump, bump, bump. With the same mouth we bless and curse. This should not be. If you're going to bless someone, you shouldn't be cursing them with the same mouth. You have to make up your mind, what do you really believe? If your actions are not matching what you believe, then either your actions have to change or your beliefs have to change. Now that is the kind of appeal that could persuade anybody. But it gets around psychological reactance because you don't tell them what to do. You just point out to them what they have chosen should make them uncomfortable. And if you're right, they will choose on their own to change. The one last thing that I want to bring up in connection with this before it's question time again. A lot of people believe that Christians don't believe in reasons, that Christians have faith, and they therefore ignore evidence. And faith is just that they will blindly accept whatever their preacher or their Christian friends tell them, and anyone who has faith does not like to think. There are a fair number of people who are hostile to Christianity, and they say, I like being able to reason through all the evidence and being able to learn and arrive at an informed decision. Christians don't do that, they just have faith. And I will admit, I know Christians who do that. And I know Christians who don't like the answer that science might give them about coronavirus, about climate change, about a lot of things, and they ignore it. And they say, I just have faith. And they are sloppy. That exists. My point is, it doesn't have to exist. There is a persuasion researcher, his name is Robert Cialdini, and what he researches are heuristics. Heuristics. Now, heuristics, pretty simple idea. When all the information you've got is confusing, and it's very hard for you to make up your mind, what all of us do, he's demonstrated this repeatedly, what all of us do, we have some shortcuts. We have some methods we turn to again and again. When everything's confusing, here's what I do. One of the ones that I think is probably quite familiar and comfortable to Japanese people, he calls it social proof. Social proof, which is effectively do what you see everybody else doing. I have an easy example of this one. When I get off the train and it's busy, first thing in the morning rush hour, and people are going all kinds of directions, and it's a train station I've never been to before, and I don't know where the exit is. I look around and I see what direction is everybody else walking, and I walk that way. Now, do I know it's the right direction? No. All the people walking is confusing, but the people getting off the train, most of them will probably turn and go a direction. If I follow other people, and sometimes I follow people and they just go and get on another train, so it doesn't always work. But that's a heuristic. Lots of confusing information. What is something I can do that's a shortcut? And he's got lots of other shortcuts. Social proof is not the only one. He's written a book on them. It's a pretty interesting book. I bring the whole thing up to say, faith is a heuristic. Christians are as persuadable as anybody else. Christians who are prepared to be responsible and think about evidence, there are plenty of us. There are plenty of Christians who like to argue. There are lots of scientists, some acclaimed scientists, who are practicing Christians and completely comfortable with evidence and argument. And yet we have faith. You can have faith and also pay attention to evidence and argument. Faith is what you turn to when all of the evidence is confusing and you need a way through it. And that's not unique to Christians. Everybody has heuristics. That just usually is ours. Okay. And I am making sure that I have not skipped over anything. And I have not. So, I'm going to hit the recorder.